Hello everyone, I'm Asen, and today I will be presenting our new reproducibility paper on the generalizability of competition of mechanisms. So first let's start with a quick introduction. The original work that we are reproducing is by Orto et al, and it examines a pretty simple experimental setup. You write the sentence redefine, for example, iPhone is developed by Google, iPhone is developed by, and then you see whether a base LLM predicts iPhone or Google, or more broadly, the subject or the replacement that you're trying to put for this subject. And what Orto et al. Claim is that there is a very clear competition of mechanisms whenever you do this. First, you have the factual mechanism, where the model tries to recall information from training. In this case, it will be that Apple is the developer of the iPhone. And then you also have the counterfactual or in-context learning mechanism, where the model would just try to continue the sentence in the same way as you taught it, basically by just placing Google there. Some of the key claims of the original paper that we're reproducing is that there is inherent competition in basically all LLMs, and also that there are a few specialized attention heads within each LLM that are responsible for the outcome of this competition. And furthermore, once you find these attention heads, you can ablate them by multiplying their attention scores by 5 or 50 to basically control whether the outcome of the competition is in favor of the factual or the counterfactual mechanism. Why we think this is important is because this control can be crucial for a number of applications. For example, in retrieval augmented generation, you usually want your model to read a few documents and to summarize them the best way it can, as opposed to remember some information from its pre-training, which is not relevant at this point. Furthermore, we believe, and so if in this retrieval augmented generation scenario, you ablate the attention heads that are responsible for the factual recall, and you basically zero them out, then theoretically you would get a model that only performs in-context learning and doesn't try to have like original ideas based on its pre-training. And then on the other side of things, if for example you're trying to make a model that's more robust against, say, jailbreaks or other adversarial prompt attacks, maybe you would want to actually increase or to boost the attention heads that are responsible for the factual mechanism, because then you would be able to have like a more influential, you'd give like more weight to the pre-training, and so the model would be less susceptible to being influenced through the prompt and in-context learning. Now, what is our contribution, given that all of this is something that Orto et al. Propose? Well, we reproduce their findings, but kind of more importantly than that, we also do several different ablations. First, we look at the model scale, and more concretely, we reproduce their findings for Llama 3.18b, whereas originally they only did it for GPT-2 small and Pythia 6.9b. Secondly, we experiment with the effect of the prompt structure. So we think that probably the reason that the models are more inclined to produce the counterfactual isn't necessarily because they understand what redefine means, but maybe because they just like see that the same sentence appears twice. And so we try paraphrasing the prompt into a question, but you'll see that in a bit. Third, we play around with the premises, which is the keywords at the start of the prompt, and see how that affects the competition of mechanisms. And finally, we also try to see if the findings generalize across different domains. Basically, if you change the topic of the prompt, are the results the same, or are there some differences? Now let's move on to the methodology. For the data processing, we use the counterfact dataset, same as Orto et al. And we actually process it a bit to produce 4 sub datasets. We have the redefined dataset, the Q&A dataset, the premise dataset, and domain dataset, each corresponding to one of our extensions, as mentioned earlier. Now, the redefined dataset, this is very similar to the dataset that Orto et al. Use, and its structure can be seen here. You have redefined iPhone is developed by Google, iPhone is developed by, but of course it doesn't have to be specifically about the iPhone and about Google. More generally, the dataset takes the following form. You have redefine as the start of your sentence, and then you put a subject, a relation, and your counterfactual object. And then you put the subject and the relation again, and you see what the LLM is going to predict. One thing that we did here is that we filtered the dataset for prompts where the models actually know the true answer. Orto et al. Claimed that they did that already, but we found that this wasn't necessarily the case. And also for Llama, of course, we had to do it from scratch. But we made sure that without the redefine and without anything else, if you just, in this example, say iPhone is developed by, GPT-2 Small automatically responds with Google, with higher probability than iPhone or anything else. Now, for our Q&A dataset, what we did is we start off the same way as with the redefined dataset, redefine, say iPhone is developed by Google, but then we paraphrase the repetition of the sentence for a question, such as what company developed iPhone? And then we put answer, colon, and we let the model continue this. By this rephrasing, as I already mentioned earlier, we expect that the model will be less inclined to repeat the counterfactual object, because it doesn't see a pattern as clearly in the prompt. To generate these questions, we used Google G5, but we basically just asked it to rephrase the sentence as a question, and we put that in. Now, for the premise dataset, all we did from the main redefined dataset is that we changed the redefined keyword for other keywords, such as review, validate, assess, fact check, etc. And we observed kind of what the difference is. And finally, for the domain dataset, we took the original redefined dataset and we categorized it into 26 different categories. So this could be like computer and electronics, arts and entertainment, sports, finance, news. To do this, we use the NVIDIA NeMo curator, which is trained to classify data into these categories. And you can see some examples here. For example, the iPhone running example that we have here is placed in the category of computers and electronics. Whereas for arts and entertainment, one example is redefine the original language of Star Wars is Croatian. And there are others, of course, but these are two types of categories that you're going to see later are pretty much at odds with each other. Now, let's explain a bit about what we actually do with this data. The main tool that we have for interpretability in this paper is LogitLens. And with this sketch, I'm going to try to very briefly explain to you how LogitLens works. So, usually, when you have a LLM, you start with a token, and this token gets fed into a so-called embedding matrix. And this embedding matrix takes the token and produces a vector representation of that token. This vector representation is then passed along the different layers of the LLM, and of course here I've also drawn the residual connections, until finally, after, in this example we have only 2 layers, but usually there are a lot more, we get to the end of the LLM, and then the final vector representation is fed through an unembedding matrix, which converts it back into a token using softmax. These two, the embedding and the unembedding matrix, are really the same matrix but inverted. And so the idea of LogitLens is, what if we take this unembedding matrix and we apply it sooner in the LLM. So, for example, you would maybe, if you want to see what the effect of the LLM from earlier layers is, you could take it here, apply the embedding matrix, and see whether you still get the same token. In this case, it would be like world. Or even better, you could also do the same thing, but right in the middle of the layers. So you could do this right after the attention heads, a specific attention head, or after the whole attention block, or after the MLP block. It doesn't really matter. And in this way, you can get a more fine-grained picture of how the data shifts and morphs throughout the LLM. And now, this is all well and good, but it has been known that logitLens is not super reliable, especially for newer models. And so Orto et al. Also use attention modification to validate the results from logitLens. What that means is that when logitLens tells you that some attention heads are more inclined towards one token or another, then we can take these attention heads and multiply their output by some value and see if that changes the output of the LLM. So basically, if the final logit changes. Graphically, you can imagine it right here as, for example, if we want to increase the factual output, then what we could do is take this most active attention head that seems to be more inclined towards the factual logit and just boost its output by multiplying it by a large value, and then see if this has any effect at the end. Now, let's briefly talk about our results. First, we of course reproduce the main claims from Orto et al., and they more or less line up with what they claim. There is, in fact, a positional distribution of the information through the different LLMs. Specifically here we're looking at GPT-2 Small, and on the right you can see that there is a very clear competition, that the values for both the factual and the counterfactual logit increase as we go through the layers. And then on the left you can see in these graphs that depending on that the information for each logit is stored differently depending on where in the sentence we're looking. So, for example, we can see that both for the counterfactual and for the factual, both for the counterfactual and for the factual, the last token is very important, which makes sense given that this is where the final representation resides at the end. But also you can see that even in early layers, for the counterfactual token, the attribute is very important, which makes sense because it is literally the token that is the counterfactual. And the subject position seems to be important for the factual token, which is kind of surprising. And we'll talk about this a bit more in the following slides. Now, we also reproduce the attention block dominance. So one of the claims of Orto et al. Is that the attention block is more important for the outcome of this competition of mechanisms than the MLP block. And we clearly see that this is the case here. For GPT-2 Small, the attention blocks are the ones that really have an impact on the outcome, whereas the MLP blocks don't seem to be that active. And finally, we also show that there is attention head specialization in GPT-2 Small and PIFIA. As you can see here, only some of the heads are pretty highly activated in terms of their output being aligned with the counterfactual or the factual token, whereas most of the heads actually don't seem to have a very concrete impact on the competition of mechanisms. Now, we also extend the results to Llama 3.18b, and there we see something a bit more complicated. First of all, we see that there are almost no attention head is highly activated. We see only one that is significantly above all the others. But when we try to ablate it, basically to multiply its output, together with the second most activated one, we see very little change in the percentage of factual versus counterfactual responses. And what this tells us is that either logit_lens is not sufficient to find the specialized attention heads in llama and then by extension newer and larger models, or that these newer and larger models just don't really have these specialized attention heads that are present in GPT-2 Small and PIFIA, for example. And then on the right, we see something else that's pretty interesting. For the first half of the network, we see basically no preference for either the factual or the counterfactual token per layer. And then only near the end, we see some increase with a very sharp spike in the very last layer. We don't know exactly why that is. We suspect that this could be because these larger models learn some sort of a representational shift at the start of the network, which helps them better process information. And then only near the end, they invert this representational shift into readable vector representations for the unembedding matrix. But this is just speculation on our part. Now, for the prompt structure, here we combine the results from both the premise dataset and the Q&A dataset, which is right here. And first, let's start with the premises. We see that changing the first word of the prompt from redefine to assess or fact check or the other ones results in quite some difference in the percentage of factual predictions at the end, with review actually being the lowest percentage, like bringing the lowest percentage of factual predictions, and other keywords such as assess or validate bringing way larger percentage of factual predictions, though still not too high. And maybe what's even more interesting is that when we then try to ablate the attention heads in GPT-2 Small that were originally found by the redefined keyword, we see that the effectiveness seems to differ a lot. Specifically for review, it's only 30%, but if you look at validate or assess, the percentage of factual responses becomes almost half. So this tells us that the small differences in the prompt structure or keywords can already have a big impact on not only the competition of mechanisms, but also on the effectiveness of the attention head ablation. And you might have already noticed here, but there are some huge numbers on the bottom of our table. This is from using redefine as well, but under the Q&A prompt structure, where, if you remember, we paraphrase the second sentence as a question. And then we see that even without any attention head ablation, we already get 49%, almost 50% factual responses. And if we do apply the ablation, our factual responses go up to 94%. Although there is a small caveat here that a lot of the responses just switch to being neither factual nor counterfactual, but some other token instead. What this roughly tells us is that the initial experiment design from Orto et al. Might not be the best way to measure the competition of mechanisms, as it seems that the competition is not really between, or more like that the model, in this case GPT-2 Small, doesn't really understand what redefine means in this context, but rather just sees the same sentence being repeated twice and just naturally finishes it in the same way that it was written in the context. And when we make it actually work for it by changing the second repetition of the sentence for a question, then it's a lot more likely to go for this factual recall mechanism. Now, finally, let us look at the results for domain analysis. Here we see something very surprising, which is that for the domain or topic that is most represented in the dataset, which is autos in vehicles, the charts or the graphs match very closely with the results reported by Orto et al. But for domains that are underrepresented, such as arts and entertainment, the result we see very different positional information encodings. Particularly, in Orto et al., they claim that the subject position is very important for GPT-2 in GPT-2 small for the factual token. But if you go to arts and entertainment, we see nothing like that. There's basically no attention being spent here. Now, why we think this might be the case? It's because we also, by the way, see this not only for autos in vehicles, but for computers and electronics. And what we expect is the case is that for these types of prompts, very often the answer is hidden in the first token of the subject. So there will be questions such as BMW is produced by whatever, BMW is produced by. And then because this car, the M3, has BMW in its name, the model is more inclined to say BMW just because it's so BMW being mentioned already twice in context. And you can imagine something similar with the, for example, questions about the Samsung Galaxy S21 or the Honda Civic or the Toyota Camry or whatever else. Whereas for questions about, say, arts and entertainment, we don't see this dependency because they are a bit more abstract, as you saw earlier about the language in which Star Wars was first produced, or whether HBO is owned by Sega. Basically, the factual token isn't present anywhere in the prompt, and this changes the dynamics that we observe. And then what we also tried is applying the attention head ablation for GPT-2 small that was found in Orto et al. We wanted to see how does this ablation affect different categories of the prompts. And what we see is that for the most represented ones, autos and vehicles and computers and electronics, it is very successful, in fact. But for the other less represented domains, such as business and industrial, or arts and entertainment, or law and government, it is the results are more mixed. It either isn't effective at all, or it is very mildly effective. And what this tells us is that the attention heads that one can find through the methodology described in Orto et al., so by applying the logit lens and then seeing which attention heads are more active and then ablating them, only seems to be dependent on the type of prompt. So if one wants to use that more generally, as we mentioned earlier, it would be very difficult. You will have to find different attention heads for all sorts of different prompts, and it's just not very tractable. So in conclusion, our reproducibility study showed that there is competition of mechanisms in basically all models, prompts, and domains. However, there are some caveats. We found no clear specialized attention heads in Llama 3.1 8b. We saw that the prompt structure and format of the query or the prompt has a very big impact on the results of that prompt. And we also saw that the attention head ablation is very dependent on prompt domain and also on the different model architectures and kind of on the prompt structure as well. And so it is not really a universal solution. In fact, further research is required until we are able to apply it in the way that we thought was interesting, say for RAGs or for defense against adversarial prompt attacks. Thank you for sticking to the end of this presentation, and if you're curious to find out more, we have an interactive dashboard with all of our results. You can also look at the code or read the original paper. Thank you.